Welcome back to Bottom Line. I'm Mark Crumpton in New York. More now on what could be a government shutdown in the offing in Washington. Brian Riedl is a senior policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation. He joins me now from Washington. Brian, welcome to Bottom Line. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
Brian, a government shutdown would mean no Social Security checks, no paychecks for U.S. troops, and on and on and on. We went through this 15 years ago. Aside from the obvious increase in the deficit, what's different this time around?
Actually, that's not true. Social Security checks do go out during a government shutdown, and the troops actually would be paid. Entitlement programs continue to run because they're not subject to the appropriations bills upon which the failure of passage results in a government shutdown. Social Security checks will still go out. Medicare and Medicaid would continue, and all national security and homeland security programs would continue as well. About 20% of the government, that is, the programs funded by discretionary appropriations bills but that aren't part of national security, are the parts that would not be funded.
Well, this week, Goldman Sachs put out an economic analysis, and it concluded that the Republican plan to cut government spending this year by $61 billion would in fact cut U.S. economic growth by 1.5% to 2% in the second and third quarters of the year. Is there a danger that too much cutting would result in a double-dip recession, as some folks have suggested?
This is the outdated view that government spending drives economic growth. This has been completely disproven. We just had an $800 billion stimulus bill that didn't create any extra government growth. The reality is, every dollar Congress injects into the economy must first be taxed or borrowed out of the economy. So if Congress cuts spending, that also means that they're going to be borrowing less out of the private sector.
Right.
So if government spends less, the private sector spends more. And furthermore, regardless of what you believe on Keynesian economics, $60 billion out of a $14 trillion economy is not going to make a significant impact on growth either way.
Well, I would beg to differ, because it might make a significant growth for the millions of people who are out of work, wouldn't you say?
Again, I'm talking in terms of broad economic growth figures that you quoted. It's not going to make a significant drag on economic growth. But let me again reiterate that the idea that government spending is the key to economic growth has been disproven time and time again. In the 80s and 90s, we had part of the greatest growth period in American history, and during that time, the federal government spending as a share of the economy dropped by a quarter. So there's no correlation at all between government spending and economic growth, other than in the outdated economic models of some of these organizations.
Well, would that government spending then include, I guess, economic stimulus, TARP program, etc., some of these things done because, as you mentioned, the 1990s were in fact a different scenario, but different times calling for different measures, perhaps?
It still doesn't change the fact that when government spends $100 billion, they first have to tax or borrow that $100 billion out of the private sector. You're not magically creating new spending from the sky. You're redistributing it from one part of the economy to the other. So if government spending drops by, say, $60 billion or $100 billion, it means that the private sector will have that much more to spend instead, rather than sending it to Washington.
Was that a concern?
Government spending isn't Santa Claus.
Was that a concern then, Brian? Because a lot of people said one of their concerns about the Bush tax cuts were they weren't paid for.
Well, again, the same thing goes, if you just look at tax cuts, the only way you increase economic growth is by productivity. If you increase incentives to work, save, and invest, or you increase productivity, you increase economic growth.
Right.
But the government's act of borrowing a dollar from one person and handing that dollar to another person doesn't create an extra dollar. It moves it around.
Brian, if I might ask in our last 30 seconds, do you see any common ground in this budget battle?
It's going to be tough. I think the Democrats seem to be pretty dug in against spending cuts. But, we just had an election where the American people rejected business as usual. And the Republicans are only looking to cut 1.6% of the federal government. I'm hoping the Democrats aren't willing to shut down the government simply over a refusal to cut 1.6% out of a government that has grown by about 25%.
If I might ask in our last 15 seconds, is it fair just to say that one side as opposed to the other is going to cut? The mandate was that they wanted people to go to Washington to work and not shut down the government, correct?
Correct, but they also want people to cut spending and end business as usual. If one side is trying to rein in spending and the other side supports business as usual, the voters will draw their own conclusions.
All right, Brian Riedl of the Heritage Foundation joining us. Brian, always good to talk to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.